And we're back. I did get a little something to drink here, and I have one more presentation to deliver on. This one is called White Cannibals. And this one's going to be, I'm trying to stay light humored on this one, but it is a very real concept. And white cannibals is something that, shouldn't just be thrown around loosely because it was a primary concern for our ancestors, which is the white devils that were going to eat them. And so I was doing some research. The concept that came out in one conversation when I was thinking about cannibalism and the ritualistic sacrifices that have been performed and conducted across time. And so I was like, damn, I wonder where's the information about white cannibalism. And so I want to share that. But first, I want to call out one major thing here. While I was looking at Nelson Mandela, getting some information prepared for that, there was a lot of riots after 1990 that happened where the police force there started opening fire on the crowds and such the day that he was released. And so I remember in 1990, the feeling and all the stories and the teachers and everybody saying Nelson Mandela was free, free at last, free at last. And so this freedom struggle narrative continues to happen. I'm gonna take it back in time with this conversation, but when I was looking at this picture, I was like, wow, that looks just like Brother George Macon. I promise you, Brother George Macon looked like Nelson Mandela when he was locked up at Robben Island for them 27 years. Look at him. If that don't look like George Macon, I promise you, hey, next time y'all see my brother George Macon in the chat, y'all tell him he looks like Nelson Mandela in Robben Island when he first got there, the radical version. And so that's my call out there. Hey, George Macon looked like Nelson Mandela when he was... Anyway, man, let me get into this presentation. Hopefully I can lighten the mood with that, because once we jump into the content, it will get a lot more serious. And so you can't just make statements like this, so I've heard. So you got to be able to prove it. And so I want to give you the information that I found that actually proves the white cannibalism narrative. And from that, you can do with it as you will, but understand that is a very real concept. The sexual sacrifices that we hear today, and even the murder cult or the representation of the murder cult, all of those were complementary to this idea of white people eating people. Now, it's not a far-fetched idea, because a starving, cold, savage people that they were colonizing parts of the world and finding themselves in what would be alliances with native and aboriginal people. But when conditions got hard, there is evidence that they would eat people. And so I'm going to present that in this presentation. To start us off here, I want to add some context to the timeline of when I'm referring to, just to really, really destroy that white man that's inside of some people's heads. So this situationship that we'll be talking about here, first and foremost, is rooted in the birth of our nation, late 1700s. So 1776 was the war, and around that time period. And so one of the first things that I wanted to look at as I was doing this was about those slave ships then. It is the pretext of colonialism is to be able to navigate the open seas, and from there to be able to embark. So you disembark from one destination, go to another one. And so in order to find that research, then we had to find those boats. And so as we were looking at it, I was drawn to this one, this site here that talks about the slave ship mutinies. And I'll read it. Slave ships were designed and equipped to deal with African resistance. From the earliest days of the trade, it was obvious that African captives, terrified though they were, would seize any opportunity to free themselves. Africans sought to escape even before they reached the coast, running away from their captors when possible. On board a ship, however, escape became more difficult. While the slave ship was anchored to the coast, European sailors loaded captives sporadically until the ship was filled or it was time to sail. The slave ship crew separated the men from the women and children when they were detained in the forts, castles, and coastal barracoons. This process of separating African captives by gender continued on the slave ships. The first Africans brought on board may have been allowed a degree of freedom of movement. As the number of captives increased, however, and the crew was greatly outnumbered, The ship became a floating prison. It was then that the crew used chains, manacles, and padlocks produced by tradesmen in Europe to shackle mainly the adult males, who were kept in batches and locked below the decks. It's a good prelude. On the right, there is a one of those things, we would call it source documentation. The original was probably housed in some museum, but what it is an early depiction. It says, representation of an insurrection on board a slave ship by Karl Bernhard Wadstrom. I don't speak German anymore. Sprechen Sie Deutsch? Not anymore. It was an essay on colonization, particularly applied to the western coast of Africa, with some free thoughts on cultivation and commerce. Also, brief descriptions of the colonies already formed or attempted in Africa, including those of Sierra Leone and Baluma. London, 1794. And so from there, that slave ship then is the one that was under examination, and they're saying the early establishments of colonies, including those of Sierra Leone and Balama. And this one, it was the slave ship, or this insurrection, was said to be right outside of Sierra Leone or Freetown. And so I just wanted to drive that home with an image here. Sierra Leone, coastal, big boat out there, and then give a little quick map of where Sierra Leone is found and Freetown. And that's where they're saying the mutiny happened aboard the ship, 1794. But I also wanted to zoom in on the image itself as the precursor to the conversation around white cannibalism. As we look at the colonial expansion and the types of savages that were feared and were said to be an authority or a governor of these certain colonies as they were moving to and fro. So I want to zoom in on that boat, and it was not a joyous occasion. It shows the elevated position of those with the rifles above those who were trying to break their chains in mutiny and insurrection. Mutiny and insurrection, or rebellion against the designed order of their time, which is the one that wanted to expand the colonies. You'll see on the left that there are some images of folks either being thrown or jumping off of the boat. You'll hear me make comments about my ancestors being the ones who did not jump from the boat. And I say that because if my ancestors had jumped from the boat, then there would be no me. For the most part, it could be like my ancestors' brothers or sisters that may have jumped the boat, or men and women from their tribe. But it could not be my direct ancestor because I would have not been produced. But the person on the boat that did survive those rifles from their elevated position and take over that boat, that is a better representation of what your ancestors could be, because those people had to survive. And so we zoom in again a little bit further in, and we notice that the high concentration of those who were at the lower position versus the concentration of those that were in the upper position. The big wall that separates them, it was one out of necessity or protection for them, but it is also one of a good character when it comes to your position or my position on whether or not segregation still matters today. Segregation still matters today as a form of protection, and those who can insulate themselves from the danger of those wielding the rifles in their elevated position or their designed elevated position do have a better chance of surviving, even more of a chance than those who would jump off the boats. And then we zoom in even further to see that the artist wanted to capture in their form a colored folks, or the Negroes, of African descent, who were not in the elevated position. But as you see here, the hands up are symbolic of the chains being broken as they were looking for their mutiny to be successful. They needed the ability to fight back. And then the other thing that you can notice in this image is the direction that they are facing. They are facing that wall. and they are looking to get past that protective barrier between them and those with the rifles or the tools for the destruction of the Black body. And so again, the representation of an insurrection on board a slave ship happened right out of Sierra Leone, which Freetown. That's just the precursor. And I give you that information about them because the slave ship itself is important, but then so is the fact that we're using imagery or art, which is media, as a form of having a conversation. And so they use this as a form of a conversation even back then. This is an image of a shipwreck. And this one was off the coast of Nova Scotia. So if one is familiar with the times, in those late 1700s, there was a group of Black Virginians who had served the Union or the British side faithfully and decided that they were loyal to the crown. And after their service, they were looking towards a protective hedge from those who would want to destroy their Black bodies. And so they moved out of that agrarian South, of that Virginia, and they moved themselves northern to Nova Scotia. And these Black loyalists then in Nova Scotia are the premise of this conversation and are the premise of the research. All right. I wanted to capture, just as a snippet, some of the graphs that show this time period and the number of slaves that were imported from Africa per the 25-year periods that they have indicated on the bottom of the graph. And then draw your attention once again to this timeline, which is the 1776 to the 1800s, the establishment of America as a sovereign nation, still an ally and a partner, facing what they were facing, but an independent nation. And you will see there that it was the highest it had ever been and would ever be when it came towards importing Africans for enslavement, excuse me. Also, to call out that participation in the transatlantic slave trade was by a number of those countries. Some had a larger impact than others, or a larger role. Of course, Portugal, they got in a little bit earlier, and I'm still conflicted about Portugal because I'm not entirely sold that at that time period, the Portuguese that they're referring to weren't of African descent themselves. But in any event, for some odd reason, they think the USA, or the United States of America, only had about 305,000 slaves imported. It's an interesting conundrum, which is why I continue to do the research. But back to the boat, white cannibalism. This image here, like the first one was called Slave Mutinies, this one is called The Departure. And as you see, it depicts what looks like on the left side going towards the right. On the left side, there is images of what appear to be the natives, as well as looks like some men who are in a beggar's type position or a suffering type of position. They're not standing up and erect on their 2 feet. And they also have their hands outstretched in an upward position as if they are looking to receive. They're not clenched as if they're looking to close off, but upward as if they are looking to receive a mercy or a kindness. It's a welcoming of a thing. Then you also have the guy with the hat who would appear to be the ship captain. And then you have some folks on the boat, including some women there, the person rowing the boat. And then as you move towards the right, it looks like rough seas, as well as what would have been a mast of one of those ships. And again, this is the shipwreck. I'm going to zoom in closer for us so that we're able to actually capture the context of this image and what the author inscribed on this early media. And so you see the image once again. Voyages, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, Emory University. So it is scholastic. The Departure was painted by Robert Schmirk in 1780. assessed researching Nova Scotia and the American Revolution. The British lost, and they evacuated about 30,000 loyalists, including 3,000 Black loyalists, to settle in Nova Scotia. The Freetown colony in Freetown is said to have been established in 1792 by Black ex-slaves called the Nova Scotian settlers. The long title of this historical artifact is called, and then they go into it more with the departure. Zoom in again, and what you'll see from the beggar's position, one of them is actually on their knees looking up as if thanking God. And that's going to be important. The others, as you see, have their hands stretched out, and they are even touching the hand of what looks like to be the captain of that shipwrecked vessel. Wrapped in a cloth, you see the man who is having his hand touched has also stretched out his hand in an upward position. Again, a welcoming gesture, or one of asking to receive something. When your palms are up, that's almost a selfish gesture, one that wants something. And that is even elevated even higher. So there is some symbolism there. But behind him, if you will, there seems to be a colored type person still on the boat, and one that one can rarely see, but looks like to be being aided off of that life raft. What I'm going to do is jump into the context of what was said under this painting from 1780. Talking about the depth of winter in 1781, Mr. Prentice was sent with public dispatches, some notes, some letters from the governor. I jumped right into it. I shouldn't have did it. There's some things that happened in this image from 1780 that confirmed white cannibalism. And this wasn't from us, this was from them. And it is housed in London's museum. The line that I've drawn your attention to is at the bottom of what was written there. It says, they had subsisted many days on the bodies of their dead companions. These white cannibals. Engraved by Dr. Rob Pollard, London, published March 8th, 1784 by Rolf Pollard, number 15, Brains Row, Captain Brains, Braynes, Special Fields and Wilkinson, and number 58 from Cornhill. It says, their shipwrecked companions in the depth of winter, 1781, so they established a chronological, when did this happen? The survivors, not those who jumped from the boat, but those who remained on the boat, continued in this place for several weeks. And this place is where they refer to as where they were shipwrecked off of Nova Scotia. It says savages afterwards went up to assist those who had been left at the shipwreck or at the wreck, of whom 5 only were found alive. Before that, it said on that ship, there was around 18 seamen and passengers. So there was more than 20 folks who embarked on this journey in 1781 to deliver the governor's dispatches. But when they got back to that boat, there were only 5 left. And when they got off the boat, which this image captures, they were greeted by what they would consider savages. And those savages, those natives in Nova Scotia, then accompanied them back to where the shipwreck occurred. And where that shipwreck occurred, there were only 5 remaining survivors found alive, according to this document. They were discovered by some of the native Indians up there in Nova Scotia. And remember that they called those native Indians savages. And in the very same sentence, they said they were discovered by some native Indian savages who afterwards went to assist those who had been left at the shipwreck, of whom 5 only were found alive. Why were there only 5 left alive? Well, they had subsisted many days on the bodies of their dead companions. White cannibalism. This is a Google map image of Sierra Leone, Freetown. 1794, there was a great slave mutiny right outside of Freetown. But in 1781, were the Black loyalists, those 3,000 Black soldiers who fought on the side of Great Britain. They, looking to survive against the odds, went to Nova Scotia to establish a settlement. Therein, there was a shipwreck. And on that shipwreck of those white folks, according to the white folks, more than 20 left. But having acquired the assistance of those native Indian savages, upon returning to the shipwreck, only found 5 alive because those survivors had subsisted on the bodies of their dead companions. Got some research notes here for you. With Freetown being established by 1792, there was work done before that to get the people to Nova Scotia. That story is important. Nova Scotia was essentially a promised land in theology. It's a primary influence connected here with the Fulani Wars and the establishment of Islam in Africa or Western Africa. But this breakdown on our information or our formation or information, our formation, it would only sidebar the conversation. So I'll only give you those 2 nuggets and then move forward. 1787, 9th of May, settlers arrived from Portsmouth, England, Granville Town, province of Freedom. They established by the London-based Committee of the Relief of the Black Poor, Granville Sharp, as we know the name to be. In 1789, Granville Town was burned down. We can tell you why and how. In 1792, Freetown was established by Black American ex-slaves called the Nova Scotian settlers under the auspices of the Sierra Leone Company. 1794 to September, Settler Town was attacked by the French in 1800. 1794 again being where that mutiny occurred. And then after that, in the 1800s, the Jamaican Maroons settled there in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Couple of more notes here to call out again. After the British were defeated, its troops helped evacuate approximately 30,000 United Empire loyalists or American Tories to settle in Nova Scotia with land grants. Soon after, Nova Scotia was divided to the present-day province of New Brunswick was created. It shows you some of those boats that were attacked versus some of those that were shipwrecked, like the one I brought you the information on here today. It says 2 months in which they suffered incredible hardships, and at length, worn out with fatigue, benumbed, diseased, and famished, they were discovered by some native Indians. Those friendly savages afterwards went to assist those who had been left at the wreck, of whom 5 only were found alive, and they had subsisted many days on the bodies of their dead companions. See the ensign from the Prentice narrative. That's found in the Toronto Library, painted by Robert Schmirk. That's your source on that white cannibalism. White cannibalism, B1 Brother Moses. Hey, There's a couple of more things that I could present to actually drive that message home. So I'm going to give you one more and then I'm going to let you go. I'm going to give you one more and then I'm going to let you go. Share the screen. White cannibals, black martyrs, fear depression and religious faith as causes of suicide among new slaves, by Dr. William D. Pearson. And it says, African slaves composed the largest immigrant group arriving in the New World prior to the American Revolution and the largest non-English migration to the North American continent during the same years. These immigrants came unwillingly to American shores, and the cruel hardships they faced during the removal from Africa to a New World bondage were part of the high human price paid for the conquest of the Americas. Had these African newcomers been Christian, theirs would have been a celebrated martyrdom, especially the sacrifice of those who chose death over forced submission to an alien faith and culture. But because they were only heathen Africans, recognition of their martyrdom was withheld. The horrors of forced migration into American slavery were increased by the miasma of misunderstanding and myth, which shrouded the ultimate destiny of the slave immigrants. From the 17th century onward, the folk beliefs of West and Central Africa, from the Senegambia to the Congo, explain the insatiable appetite of the Atlantic slave trade in terms of white cannibalism. African captives are typically found the European world of the slaver strange and frightening. When Oladu Equiano, an Igbo boy shipped to the New World in 1756 at the age of 11, first boarded a slaver and saw downcast blacks chained near a copper pot in which coastal vessels kept fires burning as a prophylactic measure. He fainted in horror and anguish. Revived, he asked the local slave merchants aiding in the loading if he were not to be eaten by these white men with horrible looks, red faces, and loose hair. Although reassured that he was not, he remained convinced, along with the rest of the cargo, that ultimately he would be eaten by these ugly men. White cannibalism. B1 Brother Moses, and those is facts. These is, you want a doctor to say it? Do you want the actual evidence from the London Museum to talk about these white cannibals? They look at the American Constitution and they think that the Constitution is the founding principle. B1 Brother Moses would say, how do you believe in the Constitution when you're talking about an era where they ate people? You're talking about an era where they were eating people, and you think that that is a moral document to guide the lives of all Americans. The same people who wrote that Constitution were founding colonies, and if they got cold and hungry, they would eat each other. And this is what you think is supposed to be the governing doctrine of Africans in America by default, because we are the descendants of the slaves. That Constitution didn't protect them, and it does not protect us. White cannibalism, B1 Brother Moses, and I salute.